Hey, it's Deep Learning Explainer. Welcome back. Today, our paper is pre-training is almost all you need. It's a way to use zero-shot learning to leverage the pre-trained transformers, pre-trained BERT models to do like a common sense reasoning. And why this paper is so impressive is because it's zero-shot learning, basically the way to do the common sense reasoning without any fine-tuning on the BERT model, can achieve the even better results than the BERT fine-tuned model. BERT model they fine-tune on a downstream task. So you can see this graph. This is their models. They just use BERT directly without any fine-tuning, out-of-box BERT models, and they achieve 80% accuracy. And compared to the ROBERTA-large model, they do the fine-tuning on the downstream task. Common sense reasoning downstream tasks, and they only have 70%, so it's 10% over that. So that's why this paper is special for me. I think you will also be interesting because they also have the way to fine tune their model. If you want to use their method to fine tune the model, then you can find out it's highly data efficient. Just when they just use 10% of the data, they can already achieve 85% accuracy. So compared to the BERT model, you only use 10% of data, but the BERT model is still like in the low 70. So you can see this, even you plug in all the data, 100% data, these methods still outperform the BERT models, the traditional BERT models. And before we dive in, if you would like to receive more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. Your subscription is my biggest support to make more videos. So let's dive right in. This paper was published by Samsung Strategy and the Innovation Lab. And highlights of this paper, just like I mentioned, they propose a new scoring methods so that you can use zero-shot learning to do the common sense reasoning. Just the way that you don't need to fine-tune the BERT model, you just use the BERT models directly, then you can achieve the very, very decent result in common sense reasoning tasks. And they also achieve a very strong result, very comparable result. And if this kind of method is very good for industrial use cases, because usually in the real world we don't have that many data points. That's when this kind of data efficiency become important. Data efficiency become very important. We don't getting labeled data is very expensive, so we want to find a way they can have very, very good performance in the very, very low data resource setup. If you have these kind of use cases, I believe this paper will be interesting for you. So let's explore what common sense reasoning is. So it's basically you will receive a premise and a set of hypotheses. Then you need to find out which hypothesis is most appropriate to this given premise. So for example, you got the premise, the man broke his toe, and the hypothesis is he dropped a hammer on his foot. Then you need to just figure out is this kind of making sense or not. And traditional approach was like they will pair the premise and one hypothesis, and to let the model decide is correct or incorrect. So as you can see, like if you are using BERT model, you need to plug in a classification token and also use a separator token to separate your premise and hypothesis. And BERT will do the binary classification on if this pair is correct or incorrect. The downside of this approach is the pre-trained model doesn't have any prior knowledge on the classification labels. The classification labels here are false, 0 false, and 1 is true. Model doesn't have any idea on that at all. So that's why the model needs to learn this semantic meanings or these kind of meanings through a lot of data points, and that's also why you need a lot more data to let the model to figure out. And this paper argues that we should actually leverage the prior knowledge within the pre-trained language models instead of using just this kind of randomly initialized weights to let the model to learn. It just takes longer time to learn. And this paper tries to address that problem. And they proposed this method to use the conjunction to replace separated token and also frame this task as a language modeling task instead of a classification task. So what I did was to firstly have this use conjunction, for example, because to replace the separated token to conjunct to connect the premise and the hypothesis, and then calculate how much the likelihood is of this given sequence. If the likelihood of this sequence, which is a combination of premise and the hypothesis, if it is very high, that means this probability is the right hypothesis for this premise. Then if the probability is very low, then it probably means this hypothesis is just wrong. It just doesn't match the premise. So in this example, the man broke his toe because he dropped a hammer on his foot. It's just like a natural sentence, right? Then if this probability is high, means this actually probably similar things that shows up in the training data the bird learns from. Then we can say, oh, this premise is likely to be the right one. And what I did that we can use the graph to illustrate a little bit more. So basically, you will have an input, a promise tokens, and also one conjunction token, and also you will also have hypothesis tokens, and they only mask the promise tokens one by one. So basically, they want to calculate the likelihood of given sequence. And the tricky thing is how they calculate. And how they calculate is to mask promise tokens one by one. So in this example, they mask the premise is the man broke his toe. Then they mask the word, the first token, the first. And to see in this given context, how much likely the bird will predict this mask token is the. And also they mask the second token. When they mask the token man, how much likely the bird can predict the word man given this context. And also they just goes on and on. Another one is broke. They mask one by one until you mask every you iterate every premise tokens. And they combine this probability of these mask tokens in the premise, and they kind of normalize it so that you have the likelihood of this sequence. If the sequence likelihood is high, that means it's likely to be the right hypothesis. As for how they calculate sequence likelihood, let's just formalize it a little bit. So it's basically very straightforward. You can have a probability of the token given this context. The bird predict the token the mask token as the mask token as man, the mask token is broke, and so on. Then you kind of multiply them together because you don't want to write a multiplication in your implementation. So you just log them. When you log them, you can just do a summation of them. So you basically calculate log probability of them, then you sum your log probabilities. And because if you have more tokens, then your probability will probably be larger. So that's why you need to normalize that by dividing to the number of your tokens. So that the probability score of this sequence will not vary too much if you have different tokens, number of tokens. And the reason they only target the premise, they only calculate the probability of premise, but definitely they have like 4 text input, the premise and the hypothesis, but only calculate probability of premise tokens. The reason behind that is that because you have one premise, then you have multiple hypotheses, then you will generate, let's say you will have one premise and 3 hypotheses, then you will have 3 pairs. But the hypotheses are different, and they can differ in length, they can differ in the words, right? And there could be the case where one hypothesis have higher word frequency. Then if you calculate the probability of that certain hypothesis, then your sequence probability will just be higher. This probability is higher is not because it makes more sense, it's more correct. It's not because of that, it's just because the word frequencies is higher. And also they will have various length. Even though you can do the length normalization, but it still will affect a little bit because normalization is not perfect. So that's the reason that why they want to do the premise only. And you also can use this similar method to calculate the probability for n-gram. So basically how you can do that is very simple. You just mask, if you want to, let's say if you want to calculate the bigram in the bigram manner, you just mask 2 tokens at a time, then you use the same formula to calculate that, and you can just write down the formula as this one. So they argue that if you use n-gram method to calculate the sequence score, you will have a better results because it just makes it more stable. And this trend kind of started to reverse after 4 grams. If you use a 5 gram, means you've masked 5 tokens at a time and calculate the sequence probability, then you will have just a slightly worse result. And if you increase to 6 grams, 7 grams, your result will just get worse and worse. And this definitely is something to do with how the Burr model was trained, because Burr model is just basically just mask a few 15% mask 15% of the tokens in the input, right? So if you mask too many tokens, it's just too different from how it was pre-trained, then the performance will just be affected. And one thing worth noting is that this method does not require any fine-tuning. You just need to use the pre-trained Burr model, because to predict the probability of a mask token is just what a Burr model does. You don't need to pre-train that any at all. So that's the beauty of this method. And to allow people to further fine-tune their model on the downstream tasks, they also propose a very straightforward way of doing this. It's basically a Chinese network. So what you have to do, you need to calculate the sequence probability of the correct premise and the hypothesis pair, and you also need to calculate the probability of the premise and incorrect hypothesis sequence. Then you input these 2 sequence likelihood to the model. Then the model should make the correct pair have the higher probability, and the incorrect pair has the have a lower probability. That's just how the Chinese network does. You just want to make the right one has higher score and the incorrect one have a lower score. And model will learn how to make it more extreme. So you can write down your loss function here. You want to lower the probability of the incorrect one, higher the correct one. So they call this a margin-based loss. It's just a way that you fine-tune. And definitely when you fine-tune your loss functions here, then you doing a backpropagation through the whole Burr model or ROBERTA model. And one thing worth to be aware of is that the conjunctions they added actually are task-specific. Depending on the task, then you will need to add a different kind of conjunctions to that. For example, for dataset COPA, sometimes you need to add a conjunction so, and sometimes you need to add a conjunction because. And for some tasks, you don't even need to add a conjunction. You just combine You just combine your premise and hypothesis, then it just makes sense. So it's highly task specific. That's the only part that you need to manually look into the data set if you want to use this method. And as for the separated sentence format, you just need to plug in the premise and the hypothesis and use the separator token to connect them. Before they did a formal experiment, they also did a task probing because they want to know if the model figure out this hypothesis is correct or incorrect. It's because model really do the common sense reasoning or just use the statistical biases. Because in some data set, the fake hypotheses are actually generated by machine, which means their distribution may be very different from those correct hypotheses which are written by human. So they want to know, is that really a case? So how they figure that out is like they only run the scoring method, sequence likelihood scoring method hypothesis. So it's like the model only know the hypothesis and model need to give the likelihood of this hypothesis, right? And they want to see if model's performance is equals to random or close to random, or model can actually outperform random. And it's supposed model's performance is supposed to be very close to random. Why? Because model, you only give the model hypothesis. Model should not know this hypothesis is correct or incorrect without having the information of a premise. So model should assign the probability to each hypothesis equally, which makes its accuracy close to random. Okay, so results are in these two data sets, in the COPA and the CommonsenseQA, the model's performance accuracy is very close to random, which is good, which means these two data sets are good. It basically tells us the fake incorrect hypothesis in these two data sets are quite close to human language. At least model couldn't just tell by the language it used to say, oh, this is fake, this is real. Model couldn't tell that. But in the SWAG and the HellaSwag, you see the very interesting results. Like they only do the sequence likelihood scoring hypothesis, and model can outperform the random so much. It tells us that the fake hypothesis in these two data sets are too fake, are generated by machine, and the distribution of those fake hypotheses are just too far away from human language. More specifically, it's too far away from natural English. To linger on that point a little bit more, they also did an experiment to do the premise only targeting or hypothesis only targeting, but definitely with full text input. You just target a different part of utterance input, different part of input. And they found out, yeah, in these two data sets, SWAG and the HellaSwag, if you only target hypothesis, you will have much higher accuracy compared to only targeting premise. It's not because targeting hypothesis is a better way. It's just because the incorrect hypothesis are too different from the correct hypothesis due to the fact they are generated by machine. So in the formal comparison, they didn't include these two data sets. Okay, so the comparison setting here's are these three. They basically want to use their own method, which is the first one, compared to the rest of two. The first one is their setting proposed methods. They have full text input, which is premise plus conjunction plus hypothesis, and they use one unigram setup plus margin best loss. So basically, it's a Chinese network. And second one is traditional setup. It's a separated sentences, premise, separated token, and hypothesis, and they use the cross entropy classifier, which is randomly initialized. And the last method is interesting. They have the full text input and have the classifier. Classifier will classify this as true or false, but with the margin-based loss. So the loss is not cross entropy; it's the margin-based loss. Is try to verify if the gain of their proposed method is because of the margin-based loss, or it's because of their full text input. So here are the results for one-shot learning, basically the way without fine-tuning the model, and you can see the results on COPA zero-shot learning. It's quite impressive. If you only target the premise, then your performance will be much higher than targeting hypothesis, which is if you only use the unigram, it's like 4% more accuracy, right? And you can see the trend. If you increase your unigram to bigram, trigram, fourth gram, then your accuracy just increase, and until you reach fourth gram, because it started to inverting that. And for the Commonsense QA, you can see the results also quite similar. It's higher when you only target the premise. It's 10% higher. It's larger, and the model performance will just keep increasing until fourth gram. And as you can see, their best performance model on the COPA dataset is 80%, which is 10% higher than the supervised model, ROBERTA-large model, which is quite impressive. But in another dataset, Commonsense QA, their best performance model is similar to the ROBERTA model. But even though I'm still pretty impressed, because this is zero-shot learning. They didn't fine-tune it at all. Here are the comparisons between their proposed model and the traditional cross-entropy classifier model. And the classifier, and they use the loss margin as loss function. They want to compare what's the difference between these three different methods. And if this is supervised learning, they all fine-tune downstream tasks, which is Commonsense dataset. And as you can see here, if they use the 100% of the dataset, their proposed methods is the best performance. But when you reduce the portion of the dataset that can be used to train the model, when you only use 10% of the data to train a model, their model actually outperform the other methods by a lot of margin. And you can see the graph here on the right. That's actually very obvious. When you only use 10%, the model still can achieve 85% accuracy, which is impressive. And the rest of two models is like just in the low 70. So you can see this method is very data efficient. And this is the comparisons results on the Commonsense QA dataset. And still the same, the trend is still the same. If you only use the very small portion of the data, the difference between their proposed methods and the rest of methods are very different. The gap is just so big. And this graph gives us a better sense of that. And you just use 1% of data, then you can still achieve the decent results. And this is good because the direction we want to go in is basically we want a model to learn how to do the task with a fewer data points, because in the real world we just don't have that many data points. We want a model to be able to generalize better. Just like this case, even just use 1% of data set, you can still have a decent performance. So that's why this method is so interesting. But in the future world of this paper is they actually want to extend this method to natural language inference, which I can imagine a lot is not much different from common sense reasoning. But as for the sentiment analysis, I am not really sure how they can integrate this method with that. But I will be very curious to see the results. And another one is they want to kind of integrate this method to the self-supervised pre-training, which I have no clue how to do that, but I'm looking forward to it. So what did we learn today? We learned a sequence scoring method. It's a way that you can leverage language models' prior knowledge to perform certain tasks and without a need of fine-tuning. And we also learned a method that is basically a way to fine-tune with sequence scoring methods, and it's more data efficient. You can achieve very good performance with a limited number of data points. And they demo the application of these two methods to solve the common sense reasoning task. And I do think we can leverage this kind of methods in other different tasks as well. We just need to be more creative to how to combine them. And yeah, that's the end of this video. And if you like the video, and give it a like, and if you would like to receive more deep learning NLP videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. Your subscription is my greatest and the best support. And other than that, enjoy your week, and I will see you next time.